Okay, so now we have Google Authentication sign-in, as well as our application listening to authentication state changes on our Firebase backend. What we need now is to actually figure out how to sign out of our auth service. Now, Firebase makes it very easy because on this auth service, we actually just call sign out and it will sign us out. But let's figure out where to put it in our application. So right now, if we look at the final application, we actually see that there's a sign out button in the header when a user is signed in. So let's implement that. So the first thing we have to do is make sure that our header is aware of when a user is signed in or signed out by giving it the app's current user state. So we're just going to pass it in as a property, this.state.currentUser. So if it's null, it will pass in null. If it's an object, such as our user object, it will pass that in. And then inside of our header component, we want to first import that auth library from our Firebase utils. And then we want to destructure the current user property that we're passing into our header from our app. And what we'll do is we'll use a ternary operator to conditionally render either a div if it's true or a link if it's false. Now, because of the nature of the ternary operator, if current user is an object, it will evaluate to true, therefore it will render a div. If it is false, such as if it was null, null evaluates to false, and then it will render the link. So what we will pass in is a div with the class name option. So we want the same styling as our link, but we want a div because we want the padding that comes with it so that our button is clickable, it's bigger. And then we're going to put an onClick method that is a functional callback, an anonymous function that calls auth.signout, which is provided to us by the Firebase auth library. And then we're just going to say here, sign out. And in our link, we're also going to have the class name of option, except it's going to take us to /signin. And here we're just going to say sign in. And now if we check our application, normally there's a sign in, but if we're signed in with our Google account, instead it'll be a sign out button, which if we click will sign us out. But we don't have our cursor pointer on it, so let's just add that to our styling here. Inside of our option, we'll put cursor pointer just to be sure. Okay, now let's also style this button box so that it looks closer to what we had in the Google styling box, as we see in our final application. Well, let's go to our custom button component. And what we'll do is conditionally render a class name based off of a prop. So we'll call the prop is Google sign-in. And then we will conditionally render using string interpolation the class name of Google sign-in. Otherwise, we'll render an empty string. And then we will also always render a custom button. Now we're able to do this because with React, everything is JavaScript. So we have a lot of flexibility here. And using this, we will now render this class of Google sign-in if this property is true. If not, then there will be an empty string, and custom button is also always rendered. Now, let's go into our styles, and let's add in the styling for Google sign-in. So we gotta add the ampersand, If we don't, then we will notice that this Sass file will end up applying the styles to a child element with the class Google Sign-In of custom button. But we want them to both be on the same element. So with the ampersand, it will say that. Because the ampersand is the same as saying custom button dot Google Sign-In with no space in between. So by doing that, now we will say background color goes to a Google blue, which I have here. It is hash 4285 F4. And then we'll also say that there's a color of white because we want white text. And then on hover, we're also going to change the background color to a darker shade of our Google blue. 357 AE8. Now I have them in front of me, so I definitely don't memorize hex colors in my spare time. But we're also going to add a border of none to our style here. And then in our sign-in component, we want to apply them. So we'll say, is Google sign-in? So this property will get passed the value of true if we don't pass a value to it, which we want because we want this to help us conditionally render that class that we just wrote on custom button. And now if we look, we'll see that we have our styling. So let's style our sign-in to look more similar and more aligned to our final application. So in our sign-in component, in our styles, we're going to switch this over to 380 pixels. And then we're also going to wrap those buttons in a div called with the class name of button. And then we will apply to this button's class, display, flex, and justify content space between. Now, if we look, our buttons are the same width as our sign-in component, but there's a little bit of extra padding here. The reason for this is because of the way that box sizing is set in all browsers. Box sizing value, which is a CSS property that's set in all browsers, is such a way that our margins, paddings, and borders all actually affect the overall size of our components. If we were to inspect this, we'll see that's what happens with our form input. You see how there's a little bit of an extra protrusion despite the fact that the orange ends before it. Well, that's actually the padding value on our input that's modifying that. If we got rid of this, we'll see that our element is now in line. So how we change this is inside of our app.css, we are going to say this universal selector. So for every element, we want box sizing to be border box. And now our elements are aligned because the padding, the margin, and the border do not affect the element size. So let's commit our code. So let's check what we have. We added in our Firebase. So we'll say integrated Firebase into application, created sign-in page with sign-in component, and sign in with Google. And now let's just push this to master. So now what we want to add to our application is email and password sign-in. But the only way to do that is we actually have to have email and password-based users in our database so that Firebase knows whether or not that user is true, like it actually exists. So in order to do that, we have to take a deeper look at Firebase Firestore. So let's do that.